What happens when a frail elderly woman with dementia is accused of theft and treated with unimaginable cruelty by those sworn to protect? As shocking truths unravel, one officer must choose between loyalty and justice, while a daughter fights to heal her mother and demand accountability. This gripping story of betrayal, courage, and hope will leave you questioning everything. Stay tuned to uncover the powerful journey of resilience and change. The sun hung low over Ridgehaven, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets of the small town. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to one another and everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. On this serene autumn afternoon, Eleanor Ellie Brooks shuffled down the sidewalk, her frail frame wrapped in a threadbare cardigan that had seen better days. She clutched a photograph of her late husband Harold to her chest like a talisman. Her hazy eyes flickered between the present and the past, struggling to reconcile the two. Ellie's dementia had slowly unraveled her once vibrant life, leaving her adrift in a sea of fragmented memories. At 74, her world had become a patchwork of fleeting clarity and aching confusion. Harold's face in the photo seemed so real to her now, closer than the trees lining the street or the faint hum of cars in the distance. "I'll be back soon, Harold," she murmured softly, though there was no one to hear her. Across town, Rachel Brooks leaned against the kitchen counter, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, but she hadn't touched the cup in front of her. Being a nurse was hard enough, but being a single mother and sole caretaker for her mother was a burden she hadn't prepared for. Rachel's phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a reminder to pick up groceries after her evening shift. A sigh escaped her lips as she glanced at the living room where Ellie had been sitting just moments ago. Her heart clenched when she realized the chair was now empty. "Mom!" Rachel called, her voice tinged with worry. She stepped into the living room, her gaze sweeping across the space. The door to the backyard was closed, the curtains drawn. No sign of Ellie. Panic flared. This wasn't the first time Ellie had wandered off. Rachel quickly grabbed her phone and called her neighbor, Mrs. Lang, who often kept an eye out for Ellie. "Mrs. Lang, have you seen my mom?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I saw her heading toward Main Street about 10 minutes ago," Mrs. Lang replied. "I thought she was with you." Rachel's stomach twisted. "Thanks, I'll go find her." Ellie's steps were slow but deliberate as she wandered into Ridgehaven's quaint downtown area. The shops, the familiar faces, the smells, they all blended into a confusing swirl. She didn't know why she was here, only that she needed to keep moving. Ahead, Harlow's Mart, the town's largest department store, loomed in the distance. Its automatic doors whooshed open as Ellie approached, drawing her into the brightly lit aisles. The fluorescent lights were harsh, and the bustling noise of shoppers grated against her fragile senses. Ellie blinked, disoriented, as she wandered from aisle to aisle. Her hand brushed against a can of furniture polish on a shelf. The label looked familiar. Harold used to use this exact brand. She picked it up, clutching it to her chest. Harold always kept the house so clean, she whispered to herself, a faint smile touching her lips. Further down the aisle, Ellie's attention was drawn to a display of scarves. One in particular, a soft blue with delicate floral patterns, caught her eye. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing the fabric as memories flickered in her mind. Rachel had always loved scarves like this. "You'll look so pretty in this," Ellie murmured, draping it carefully over her arm. Ellie's wanderings brought her to the candy aisle, where the bright orange wrappers of her favorite chocolate bars stood out. A flicker of joy crossed her face as she reached for a few, tucking them into her pocket absent-mindedly. Without realizing it, Ellie walked toward the exit, still clutching the polish and the scarf. The warm breeze from outside hit her as the automatic doors opened again. For a brief moment, she felt a sense of calm. "I'll bring these home to Harold and Rachel," she murmured, stepping into the sunlight. Inside the store, Todd McLean, a sharp-eyed clerk in his early 20s, noticed Ellie leaving without stopping at the register. His lips tightened into a thin line. "Another one," he muttered under his breath, picking up the phone behind the counter. His coworker, Marissa, glanced up from restocking a shelf. "Todd, she looks harmless. Maybe she just forgot." "Doesn't matter," Todd replied coldly. "Rules are rules. She needs to learn that." Todd dialed the local police station, his voice curt as he described the incident. "She's an older lady, white hair, blue cardigan," Todd said. "Looks like she took some stuff. Probably worth a few bucks. Can you send someone over?" Marissa frowned, glancing toward the doors. "I don't think this is necessary." "Marissa, we can't just let people walk out with stuff," Todd snapped. "It's about principle." Ellie continued down the sidewalk, her pace unsteady. Across the street, the field of wildflowers stretched out before her like a memory brought to life. The vibrant yellows and purples called to her, and she shuffled toward them, her mind lost in a haze. She didn't hear the sound of the police cruiser pulling up behind her, the tires crunching against the gravel. Officer Grayson Teller stepped out, his expression hard as he adjusted his belt and scanned the area. A rookie cop with something to prove, Gray had always believed that enforcing the law required strength and authority. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice firm. Ellie didn't respond. She was too focused on the flowers. Gray's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, stop right there!" Ellie turned slowly, confusion etched on her face. I'm going home," she said softly, her voice trembling. Gray took a step closer, his hand resting on his baton. "Put down what's in your hands and step toward me." Ellie looked down at the items she was holding, the polish, the scarf, and back up at Gray. Her mind struggled to make sense of the situation. I I don't understand," she murmured. Gray's patience wore thin. He moved closer, his voice sharp. "You need to stop resisting." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Tommy Wilder, a high schooler walking his dog, pulled out his phone and started recording. "Is this really necessary?" An older woman, Shirley Powell, called out. Gray ignored her, his focus on Ellie. In one swift motion, he grabbed her arm, causing her to drop the item she was holding. Ellie cried out in pain, her fragile bones no match for his rough grip. "I just want to go home," she sobbed. "Stop resisting," Gray barked, twisting her arm behind her back. The crack of her shoulder was audible, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Tommy's camera captured everything, the look of confusion and pain on Ellie's face, the cold determination in Gray's. Ellie's knees buckled, and she collapsed into the dirt, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The wildflowers she had been so drawn to were now crushed beneath her frail body. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And in the distance, Rachel Brooks was driving frantically through Ridgehaven, her heart pounding as she searched for her mother, unaware of the storm that had already begun. The interior of Harlow's Mart buzzed with the steady hum of commerce. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, illuminating rows of neatly stocked shelves. The store was alive with the chatter of shoppers, the occasional beep of a register, and the muffled squeak of shopping cart wheels. For most, it was a routine afternoon. For Ellie Brooks, however, it was a maze of overstimulation, a puzzle her mind couldn't quite piece together. She hesitated just inside the entrance, blinking under the harsh lights. Her frail fingers clutched the edge of her cardigan as her gaze darted around the aisles. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, but the sound barely registered. Somewhere in her fragmented memories, this place felt familiar. Ellie shuffled forward, her shoes scuffing the polished tiles. The cleaning supplies aisle caught her eye first. She paused in front of a display of lemon-scented furniture polish. The logo on the bottle seemed to tug at a thread deep in her mind, pulling loose a hazy recollection of her late husband, Harold. He had always kept their home immaculate. Every weekend he'd hum a little tune as he polished the wood furniture, his hands meticulous and careful. "Harold would like this," Ellie murmured, her voice soft and unsure. She picked up a can of the polish, clutching it to her chest as if it were a precious keepsake. Further down the aisle, a display of colorful scarves caught Ellie's attention. Her steps slowed as her gaze settled on a soft blue scarf patterned with tiny yellow flowers. Something about it reminded her of Rachel, her daughter, her anchor, the one person who grounded her in moments of clarity. Rachel had always loved scarves. Ellie could almost see her now, wearing one just like this, her smile warm and comforting. Ellie reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers brushing against the soft weave. For a fleeting moment, she felt a connection, as if she were tethered to reality again. "You'd look beautiful in this, Rachel," she whispered, draping the scarf over her arm. Ellie continued to wander, moving aimlessly between aisles. The brightly colored wrappers of candy bars stood out to her like beacons. Orange. Harold had always loved the ones in the orange wrappers. Her thoughts flickered again, fragments of long-lost Sundays when Harold would sit with his coffee, unwrapping a candy bar as he read the paper. She reached for 2 bars, tucking them into her cardigan pocket with a faint hum. She didn't notice the store clerk, Todd McLean, watching her from behind the counter. Todd had been restocking the display of batteries when he first noticed Ellie. His initial glance had been dismissive. She looked harmless after all. But as she continued to drift through the aisles, his brow furrowed. He watched her pick up a can of polish, then a scarf, then a few candy bars. She wasn't carrying a basket, and she wasn't heading toward the registers. Todd's frown deepened. "Another one," he muttered under his breath, setting down the box he was holding. Meanwhile, Marissa Hill, a part-time cashier who had been working alongside Todd for over a year, glanced up from her station. She noticed Ellie, her frail figure moving slowly toward the store's exit, the scarf and polish still in her hands. "Hey, Todd," Marissa said quietly, motioning toward Ellie. "Look at her. Do you think she forgot to pay?" Todd followed her gaze and snorted. "Forgot? Yeah, right." Marissa gave him a pointed look. "She looks confused. Maybe we should—" "She's not confused," Todd interrupted, his tone sharp. "She's stealing." "Todd, come on. She's old. Maybe she doesn't even realize." "It doesn't matter if she realizes it or not," Todd snapped. "Rules are rules." Marissa hesitated, glancing back at Ellie, who was now stepping through the automatic doors. "You really think this is necessary?" "Yes, I do," Todd said firmly as he picked up the phone. Ellie stepped outside into the warm afternoon air. The sunlight was soft and golden, filtering through the trees that lined the parking lot. She paused, looking down at the items in her hands. For a moment, her brow furrowed as if she were trying to remember something. "Where did these come from?" she murmured. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as her gaze shifted toward the meadow across the street. The field of wildflowers called to her, their vibrant colors swaying gently in the breeze. The sight brought a faint smile to her lips. "Home," she thought. "I need to go home." She shuffled toward the field, the scarf still draped over her arm and the can of polish cradled in her hand. Back inside, Todd was already on the phone with the local police. His voice was clipped and businesslike as he relayed the situation. "Yes, this is Todd McLean at Harlow's Mart," he said. "We've got a shoplifter here. An older woman, white hair, blue cardigan. She just walked out with a few items, some cleaning supplies, a scarf, maybe some candy. I don't know the exact value, but it's still theft." Marissa's frown deepened as she listened to Todd. "You're seriously calling the cops over a couple of dollars worth of stuff?" she whispered. Todd ignored her, continuing his conversation. "She was acting strange. Kinda aggressive. Can you send someone over to check it out?" Marissa rolled her eyes. "Aggressive? She's barely 5 feet tall." Todd shot her a glare. She pulled the scarf off the rack pretty quickly. Could have been a warning sign. You don't know what people are capable of. Marissa crossed her arms but said nothing further. Her stomach churned with unease as she watched Todd hang up the phone. "They're sending someone," Todd announced, his tone smug. "Great," Marissa muttered under her breath. "Just great." Outside, Ellie had already crossed the street, stepping into the meadow. The soft rustle of grass beneath her feet and the gentle sway of the flowers seemed to calm her. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the petals of a yellow daisy. She didn't know why she had come here or what she was supposed to do. The only thought that lingered was Harold's voice in her mind, whispering something she couldn't quite understand. Behind her, the distant wail of a siren began to rise, cutting through the tranquil afternoon like a blade. But Ellie didn't notice. She was too lost in her memories, too caught up in the simple beauty of the flowers around her. And back at the store, Todd stood by the counter, watching as a police cruiser pulled into the lot. His arms crossed over his chest, his expression self-satisfied. "She'll learn," he muttered to himself. "Rules are rules." Marissa, standing a few feet away, didn't say a word, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all wrong. The faint sound of the siren grew louder, echoing in the quiet town, a harbinger of what was to come. The piercing wail of a siren cut through the tranquility of Ridgehaven, shattering the calm like a stone dropped into still water. Birds scattered from their perches, and heads turned toward the source of the sound. The blue and red lights of Officer Grayson Teller's cruiser flickered against the pale facades of nearby buildings as the car pulled into the Harlow's Mart parking lot. Grayson Teller, a rookie officer just shy of his 25th birthday, slammed the cruiser door with more force than necessary. His polished boots crunched against the asphalt as he adjusted his belt, his hand brushing the baton at his hip. Gray was a man on a mission, a cop determined to prove himself, no matter the cost. His years at the academy and countless lectures from his father, a retired officer with a spotless record, had drilled into him one truth: authority was everything. He needed to command respect, and he needed to show the world and the department that he wasn't someone to mess with. Inside the store, Todd McLean was waiting near the counter, arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. "She's out there," Todd said, motioning toward the meadow across the street. "Old lady, white hair, blue cardigan. She took off with some stuff." Gray narrowed his eyes as he followed Todd's gesture. Through the glass doors, he could just make out a frail figure moving slowly in the distance, her hunched frame bending toward the ground as if she were inspecting something. "She's in the field?" Gray asked, incredulous. "Yeah, picking flowers or something," Todd said with a shrug. "You'll see. She's acting all confused, but she pulled my scarf off the rack like she knew what she was doing. Gray nodded curtly, his jaw tightening. I'll handle it. Ellie Brooks stood in the middle of the wildflower field, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the vibrant yellows and purples around her. She knelt carefully, her trembling hands brushing against a cluster of daisies. So lovely, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the breeze. Harold would have loved these. Her mind, fractured and fleeting, latched onto the flowers as if they were the answer to an unspoken question. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps, the heavy crunch of boots against the dry grass. Ma'am! Gray's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Ellie froze, her fingers still tangled in the stems of the flowers. Slowly, she turned her head, squinting against the sunlight. Gray stepped closer, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on the items Ellie was holding. The can of polish gleamed in the sunlight, and the scarf hung loosely over her arm. You need to stop right there, Gray barked, his voice rising. Ellie blinked, confusion clouding her expression. I'm going home, she said softly, her words trembling like leaves in the wind. Gray's patience was already thin. He took another step forward, his hand now resting on the grip of his baton. Put down what's in your hands and step toward me, he ordered. Ellie tilted her head, her frail mind struggling to process his words. She took a small, hesitant step backward instead of forward. I don't understand, she murmured. From the sidewalk, Tommy Wilder, a high school sophomore walking his dog, stopped to watch the scene unfold. His phone was already in his hand, and with practiced ease, he began recording. Is she in trouble? Tommy's younger sister Abby asked, tugging at his sleeve. Quiet, Abs, Tommy said, his voice low. I'm getting this on video. Nearby, Shirley Powell, a retired teacher, paused her afternoon walk. She recognized Ellie instantly. Everyone in Ridgehaven knew the Brooks family. That poor woman, Shirley muttered to herself. She moved closer, keeping a safe distance but unable to look away. Ma'am, this is your last warning, Gray's voice boomed. He was mere feet from Ellie now, his posture exuding authority. Ellie's lips quivered. She clutched the scarf tighter to her chest, as if it were a lifeline. I just want to go home, she said, her voice cracking. Gray lunged forward, grabbing Ellie's arm with a force that far outweighed what was necessary. The sudden movement caused her to drop the can of polish, which rolled to a stop in the dirt. Ellie let out a startled cry. No! Please! The crowd that had begun to gather murmured uneasily. Shirley stepped closer, raising her voice. Officer, she's not resisting. Can't you see she's confused? Gray ignored her, his grip tightening around Ellie's thin arm. She stumbled, her knees buckling under the pressure. I said stop resisting, Gray growled. I don't understand, Ellie whimpered, her free hand shaking as she tried to steady herself. In his frustration, Gray twisted Ellie's arm behind her back. The sharp crack of bone was audible even to those standing several yards away. Ellie let out a scream of pain, her frail body collapsing into the wildflowers. The murmurs from the crowd turned into gasps. Tommy's phone shook slightly as he zoomed in, capturing every second. Did he just... Abby's voice trailed off in horror. Shut up, Abs, Tommy muttered, though his hands trembled. Shirley stepped forward, her face pale. Officer, stop! She's hurt! Gray didn't let go. He fumbled for his handcuffs, snapping them tightly around Ellie's wrists as she whimpered in pain. This is unnecessary, Shirley shouted. She's not a threat! Gray shot her a glare. Step back, ma'am, or I'll have to detain you too. Ellie lay in the dirt, her breathing shallow, her face contorted in agony. The scarf she had clung to so tightly now lay crumpled beside her, the vibrant wildflowers crushed beneath her frail body. I'm sorry, Ellie whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't mean to. Gray stood over her, his expression cold and unyielding. The law is the law, he muttered under his breath. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Tommy kept recording, his heart pounding as he captured the image of Ellie being dragged to her feet, her arm hanging limp at her side. Mom's not going to believe this, Tommy said, more to himself than to anyone else. Are you okay, ma'am? Shirley called out, her voice tinged with desperation. Ellie didn't respond. Her gaze was unfocused, her mind retreating into a fog of confusion and pain. Gray hauled Ellie toward his cruiser, ignoring the protests from the onlookers. You all need to disperse, he said, his tone sharp. This is a police matter. As the cruiser's door slammed shut, Ellie slumped against the seat, her head leaning heavily against the window. The flowers she had admired so lovingly just moments ago were now a distant memory, replaced by a haze of fear and pain. From the sidewalk, Shirley stared in disbelief. This isn't right, she muttered. Tommy stopped recording, his hands still shaking. I got the whole thing, he said to no one in particular. As Gray drove away, the murmurs of the crowd lingered in the air, a growing storm of outrage waiting to erupt. And somewhere down the road, Rachel Brooks was still searching for her mother, unaware that her world was about to change forever. The fluorescent lights inside the Ridgehaven Police Department buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the lobby. Rachel Brooks burst through the double doors, her heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She hadn't even parked her car properly outside. The engine was still running. The moment Mrs. Lang had called to tell her about Ellie's arrest, Rachel had driven like a woman possessed, her mind racing with dread. The sight of her mother, fragile and confused, being handcuffed in a field, the image Mrs. Lang described, seemed too surreal to be true. Rachel's heart had refused to believe it, but her gut told her otherwise. At the front desk, Officer Stevens, a middle-aged man with a graying mustache, barely glanced up from his paperwork. "I'm here for my mother," Rachel said, her voice trembling but firm. Stevens looked up lazily, his eyes flicking over her with indifference. "Name?" "Ellie Brooks," Rachel said sharply. "She's 74. She has dementia. Where is she?" Stevens sighed, his irritation evident. He shuffled through a clipboard before nodding toward a small holding area to the right of the lobby. "She's back there," he said. "Just a heads up. She got a little physical during the arrest. Might be a bit shaken up." Rachel's breath caught. "Physical? Are you serious? She weighs maybe 90 pounds soaking wet. She has dementia. What kind of physical are you talking about?" "Ma'am," Stevens said, his tone dismissive, "I wasn't there. You'll have to talk to the officer who brought her in." Rachel didn't wait for an invitation. She strode past the desk, ignoring Stevens' half-hearted protests. In the holding area, Ellie sat slumped on a bench, her wrists bound in front of her with plastic cuffs. Her cardigan hung crookedly off her shoulders, and her arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. Bruises were already blooming along her wrists and forearms. Her face, pale and drawn, was streaked with tears. "Mom!" Rachel rushed to her side, kneeling in front of her. Ellie's eyes flickered with faint recognition, but her gaze was clouded with confusion. "Rachel?" she murmured weakly. I was just picking flowers. Harold likes flowers." Rachel's throat tightened as she reached for Ellie's hands, gently cradling them in her own. "Mom, it's me. I'm here." Ellie flinched slightly, her body trembling. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to go home," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Rachel's anger flared, hot and immediate. "What did they do to you?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Before Ellie could respond or even attempt to, Officer Grayson Teller entered the room, his posture stiff and authoritative. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone clipped. Rachel stood, her eyes blazing. "You're the one who did this, aren't you? You arrested her?" Gray raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral. "Your mother was caught shoplifting. She resisted arrest, and I had no choice but to restrain her." "Resisted?" Rachel's voice rose. "She has dementia. She doesn't even know where she is half the time. And this," she gestured to Ellie's bruised arms and twisted shoulder, "is what you call restraint?" Gray's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I understand this is upsetting for you, but your mother's actions—" "Her actions?" Rachel cut him off, her voice shaking with fury. "She's sick. She doesn't understand what's happening. And you? What kind of person manhandles an elderly woman like this?" Gray's expression hardened, his hands resting on his belt. "I followed protocol," he said firmly. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Protocol? That's what you're hiding behind? Protocol? Look at her!" The door to the holding area opened, and Captain Roger Doyle stepped in, his presence commanding. His graying hair and stern expression gave him an air of authority that made people pause. "What's going on here?" Doyle asked, his eyes darting between Rachel, Gray, and Ellie. "This officer brutalized my mother," Rachel said, pointing at Gray. "She's 74, for God's sake. Look at her." Doyle's gaze flicked to Ellie before returning to Rachel. His expression was unreadable. "Miss Brooks, I understand your frustration, but Officer Teller was doing his job. Your mother was reported for shoplifting and failed to comply when confronted." "Failed to comply?" Rachel repeated, her voice incredulous. "She doesn't even know what day it is most of the time. She needs help, not handcuffs." Doyle sighed, clearly eager to de-escalate the situation. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you're welcome to do so. But I assure you, Officer Teller followed department guidelines." Rachel stared at him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and steady. Doyle nodded, his tone placating. "You're entitled to your opinion, ma'am. In the meantime, you're free to take your mother home once we process her release paperwork." Rachel didn't respond. She turned back to Ellie, gently helping her stand. Ellie winced, her injured shoulder causing her to gasp in pain. Once they were outside, Rachel guided Ellie into the passenger seat of her car. The drive home was silent, save for Ellie's occasional murmurs. "Rachel?" Ellie said softly, her voice hesitant. "Yes, Mom? Am I in trouble?" Rachel gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. No, Mom, you're not in trouble. That night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent hours researching, combing through articles and legal forums, trying to find someone, anyone, who could help. Finally, she found a name. Linda Harper, a high-profile civil rights attorney known for taking on cases of police misconduct. Harper's reputation was fierce. She was relentless in the courtroom and had a track record of holding officers accountable. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number. "This is Linda Harper," a crisp, professional voice answered. Rachel took a deep breath. "Miss Harper, my name is Rachel Brooks. My mother, she was arrested today. She's 74. She has dementia and the police—" Her voice cracked and she paused to steady herself. "The police did what?" Linda's tone sharpened, her interest piqued. "They brutalized her," Rachel said, her anger returning. "She's bruised, her shoulder might be broken, and they're trying to justify it by saying she resisted arrest. She didn't. She couldn't." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Linda spoke again, her voice was resolute. "Tell me everything." Rachel poured out the story, leaving nothing out. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. "This isn't just about my mother," Rachel said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "This is about how they treat people like her, people who can't defend themselves. They need to be held accountable." Linda's reply was immediate. "I agree, and I'll take your case." Relief flooded Rachel, but it was tempered by determination. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Ellie. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what they had endured. As Rachel ended the call, she glanced toward the living room, where Ellie sat quietly in her chair, staring out the window. The bruises on her arms seemed even darker under the soft glow of the lamp. "We're going to fight this, Mom," Rachel whispered. "I promise." And for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. The grainy footage shook the world in under 48 hours. Tommy Wilder, the teenager who had filmed the harrowing arrest, uploaded the video to his social media account late one evening. The caption was simple but powerful. "This is what happened to a 74-year-old woman with dementia. #justice for Ellie." The video began with Ellie, frail and confused, wandering through the meadow. Her hands clutched wildflowers, her steps unsteady. Then came Officer Grayteller's booming commands, the crack of Ellie's shoulder, and her heart-wrenching cries. Tommy's trembling voice in the background whispered, "Why is he doing this?" The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had garnered tens of thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. By morning, it was on every social media platform, shared by influencers, activists, and even celebrities. The hashtag Justice for Ellie surged to the top of the trending charts, accompanied by a tidal wave of outrage. The small town of Ridgehaven woke up to an entirely different world. Outside the police station, protesters gathered with signs that read, "End police violence" and "Elderly lives matter." Their chants echoed down Main Street. "Justice for Ellie! No justice, no peace!" Rachel Brooks watched it all unfold from the confines of her living room. The video had been replayed on news stations nonstop. She saw her mother's frail body crumpling to the ground over and over again. Each time felt like a dagger to her heart. Sitting beside Ellie, Rachel clutched her mother's hand tightly. Ellie, as always, seemed distant, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. "Mom," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're fighting for you." Ellie turned to Rachel, her expression soft but vacant. She didn't respond, but she squeezed Rachel's hand gently. Outside, Ridgehaven was a town divided. On one side were those demanding accountability for Officer Teller and systemic reform in policing. On the other were supporters of Teller, who viewed the uproar as a baseless attack on law enforcement. Leading the protests was Jenna Alvarez, a local activist whose brother had died in police custody 2 years earlier. Jenna, a fierce and charismatic figure, stood at the forefront of the crowd with a megaphone in hand. "This isn't just about Ellie Brooks," Jenna shouted, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about every single person who has been brutalized by a system that protects officers over the people they're supposed to serve. This stops now." Her words ignited the crowd. "Justice for Ellie!" they roared in unison. Jenna stepped down from the podium and joined Rachel, who had ventured to the protest despite her anxiety. "Rachel," Jenna said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. We're here to fight with you." Rachel nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she murmured. "I just want my mom to be okay. I want her to feel safe again." Inside the Ridgehaven Police Department, the mood was tense. Officer Teller sat in Captain Doyle's office, his jaw clenched as he watched the news coverage of the protests. His name was plastered across the screen, and the video of Ellie's arrest looped endlessly in the background. "They're making me out to be a monster," Gray muttered, his voice laced with anger. Doyle leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You need to control the narrative," he said. "The department can't afford another scandal. Get out there and explain yourself." That evening, Gray appeared on a local news program, his expression carefully rehearsed. "The video doesn't tell the whole story," he said, his tone calm but defensive. "Miss Brooks was behaving erratically and posed a potential threat to herself and others. My actions were in line with protocol." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. A 74-year-old woman with dementia was a threat? Gray's jaw tightened, but he didn't falter. "We didn't know she had dementia at the time. All we saw was someone refusing to comply and acting unpredictably. In situations like that, officers are trained to prioritize safety." The segment aired that night, and while some viewers bought into Gray's narrative, others were outraged by what they saw as a blatant attempt to justify cruelty. The public reaction was immediate and polarizing. Social media exploded with debates. "She was confused. How could she be a threat?" one user tweeted, garnering thousands of likes. "Cops have a tough job. People need to stop judging without knowing all the facts," another countered. Meanwhile, Rachel found herself thrust into the spotlight. Journalists camped outside her home, eager for a comment. Activists called, offering support and resources. The weight of it all felt suffocating. One evening, after tucking Ellie into bed, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. Her phone buzzed constantly, notifications lighting up the screen. She glanced at a message from Linda Harper. "We're making progress. Stay strong." Rachel took a deep breath and typed out a reply. "I'll never stop fighting for her. Thank you." As the protests grew, so did the demands for accountability. Jenna Alvarez organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to share their experiences with law enforcement. The stories poured out, tales of excessive force, racial profiling, and a system that seemed designed to protect officers at all costs. Rachel spoke at the meeting, her voice trembling but resolute. "My mother didn't deserve this," she said. "She's a kind, gentle woman who didn't understand what was happening. And now, because of one officer's actions, she's afraid all the time. This isn't justice. This isn't protection. It has to change." Her words were met with thunderous applause. For Gray, the pressure mounted. Anonymous threats began arriving at his home, and his fellow officers grew wary of associating with him. "They're trying to ruin my life," Gray complained to his lawyer during a late-night call. Moreland sighed. "You need to stay calm. Stick to the narrative we've built. This will blow over." But Gray wasn't so sure. The protests showed no signs of stopping, and the video continued to dominate headlines. He felt the walls closing in, his once unshakable confidence starting to crack. Back at the Brooks household, Rachel found moments of solace with Ellie. Despite everything, her mother's occasional moments of clarity reminded Rachel of what she was fighting for. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Ellie reached out and gently touched Rachel's cheek. "You're strong," Ellie said softly. Rachel smiled, her eyes welling with tears. "I have to be, Mom. For you." The Ridgehaven Police Department buzzed with an energy that wasn't normal for a quiet town. Conversations were hushed, but the tension hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud. Officer Dana Caldwell, seated at her desk, stared blankly at her computer screen. She had been replaying the scene from the wildflower field in her mind ever since the day it happened. It wasn't the first time Dana had witnessed something that felt wrong, something that twisted her gut and left a bitter taste in her mouth. But this time, the image of Ellie Brooks, bruised and broken in that field, refused to fade. She rubbed her temples, the soft hum of the office doing little to drown out her thoughts. Across the room, Gray Teller sat at a table with a few officers, his laughter cutting through the room like a blade. His booming voice carried over the other conversations, his words filled with the smug confidence that came from someone who believed he was untouchable. "She came at me with some cleaning spray," Gray said, chuckling as he leaned back in his chair. "I mean, what was I supposed to do? Let her attack me?" The officers around him chuckled, but Dana felt her stomach churn. Later that evening, Dana found herself in the break room, alone. She poured a cup of stale coffee, the bitter smell filling the small space. As she turned to leave, the door swung open and Gray walked in. "Caldwell," he said, flashing her a grin. "How's it going?" Dana tensed. "Fine." Gray grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, leaning casually against the counter. "You've been quiet lately. Everything good?" "Yeah," Dana said quickly. "Just busy." Gray studied her for a moment, his grin fading slightly. "Look, about that arrest. I know you were there, and I know it probably looked intense, but you know how it is. People don't understand what we deal with out there. Dana didn't respond. She stared into her coffee, her reflection shimmering in the dark liquid. I mean, come on, Gray continued, his tone light but with an edge of arrogance. She was stealing, acting erratic. You saw how she kept trying to walk away. If I hadn't acted, who knows what could have happened. Dana's grip on the coffee cup tightened. She's 74, Gray, and she has dementia. Gray shrugged, his expression hardening. Doesn't matter how old she is. The law's the law. She resisted, and I handled it. End of story. For Gray, it might have been the end of the story. But for Dana, it was the beginning of a storm she couldn't ignore. That night, Dana sat alone in her small apartment, the TV droning softly in the background. She wasn't watching, though. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by memories of the day in the field. She could still hear Ellie's cries of pain, still see the way her frail body crumpled under Gray's aggression. This wasn't the first time Dana had questioned her role in the department. She had joined the force with the hope of making a difference, of helping people. But over the years, she'd seen things that chipped away at that idealism. Officers turning a blind eye to excessive force. Complaints from civilians brushed under the rug. And now, this. Dana's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a text from an unknown number. Don't make waves, Caldwell. Keep your head down. Her breath hitched as she stared at the message. The warning was clear, and it sent a chill down her spine. The next morning, the department was buzzing again. News of Ellie's arrest, and the subsequent outrage, was spreading like wildfire. Dana heard snippets of conversations as she walked through the station. She resisted arrest, one officer said, his tone dismissive. People don't understand what it's like out there, another added. Dana kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. She felt the weight of her silence pressing down on her, but the fear of speaking out kept her rooted in place. At lunch, she found herself seated near Gray again. He was in the middle of recounting his version of the story to a group of officers, embellishing every detail to paint himself as the hero. She tried to spray me with the cleaning product, Gray said, shaking his head. I had no choice but to take her down. Dana's blood boiled. That wasn't what happened, and Gray knew it. But no one was questioning him. You handled it perfectly, one officer said, clapping Gray on the shoulder. That's why we need people like you out there, another added. Dana excused herself and left the room, the walls of the station suddenly feeling suffocating. Later that day, Dana was called into Captain Doyle's office. She stepped inside, her nerves on edge. Doyle sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Caldwell, he began, gesturing for her to sit. I want to talk to you about the Brooks case. Dana sat down, her heart racing. I understand you were there during the arrest, Doyle said, leaning forward. Gray's already submitted his report, but I wanted to hear from you. Do you think his actions were justified? Dana hesitated. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She could tell the truth and risk everything, her career, her reputation, her safety, or she could stay silent, like she always had. Gray handled the situation, Dana said finally, her voice quiet. He followed protocol. Doyle nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. This department has to present a united front, especially with the attention this case is getting. Dana nodded, but the weight of her words settled heavily on her chest. That evening, as Dana drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had been building inside her. The pressure from the department, the veiled threats, the guilt, it was all too much. When she arrived home, she sat in her car for a long time, staring at the dashboard. Finally, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Rachel Brooks. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a moment before she pressed it. Hello? Rachel's voice was sharp, filled with tension. Miss Brooks, this is Officer Dana Caldwell, Dana said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you about your mother's case. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was cautious but determined. I'm listening. And for the first time, Dana felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the fallout would be, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay silent any longer. The Ridgehaven Courthouse was a stark, imposing building, its stone facade reflecting the somber gravity of the events inside. By the time the trial began, a large crowd had gathered outside. Protesters held signs that read, Justice for Ellie and End Police Brutality. The hum of chanting voices and the rhythmic clanging of tambourines filled the crisp morning air, echoing down the streets of the small town. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was no less charged. The gallery was packed with journalists, concerned citizens, and members of Ellie's family. Rachel sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped together, her gaze fixed on Linda Harper, the attorney who had quickly become her fiercest ally. Linda, known for her razor-sharp courtroom presence, stood tall and composed at the plaintiff's table. Her suit was immaculate, her demeanor calm but commanding. Across the room, Gray Teller sat stiffly beside his defense attorney, Thomas Moreland, a seasoned lawyer whose reputation for spinning narratives preceded him. Gray's face was impassive, though his jaw twitched occasionally, a subtle betrayal of his nerves. The trial began with opening statements. Linda approached the jury, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. She paused, meeting their eyes one by one before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice measured but powerful. "This case is about an abuse of power. It's about an officer who saw a vulnerable elderly woman and chose to use force instead of compassion, control instead of understanding." She gestured toward Ellie, who sat quietly beside Rachel. The bruises on her arms had faded, but the emotional toll was written in the lines of her face. "Ellie Brooks is not a criminal," Linda continued. "She's a 74-year-old woman with dementia. She wandered into a store, confused and disoriented, and left with items she didn't realize she hadn't paid for. And for this, she was tackled, handcuffed, and injured so severely that she now requires surgery to repair her shoulder. Today, we will prove that Officer Grayson Teller's actions were not only unnecessary, but reckless. And we will show you the cost of that recklessness, not just to Ellie Brooks, but to all of us who believe in justice and humanity." Moreland's opening statement was a stark contrast. He approached the jury with an air of calm authority, his voice smooth and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is not about brutality or injustice. It's about a police officer doing his job in a difficult situation. Officer Teller was faced with a suspect who refused to comply with his commands, who resisted arrest, and who, unfortunately, had to be restrained to ensure the safety of everyone involved." He glanced at Gray, then at the jury, his expression resolute. "Policing is not easy," Moreland continued. "It requires split-second decisions and unwavering commitment to the law. Officer Teller acted according to his training and within the bounds of protocol. We ask that you keep this in mind as you hear the evidence in this case." The trial moved swiftly into testimony and evidence. Linda began by presenting Tommy Wilder's video. The unedited footage, played on a large screen for the courtroom, captured every excruciating detail: Ellie's confused attempts to explain herself, Gray's harsh commands, and the sickening crack of her shoulder as she was forced to the ground. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the video played. Rachel gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. Gray shifted in his seat, his expression tightening as the damning footage filled the room. Linda let the silence linger for a moment after the video ended. Then, she stepped forward. "This is what Officer Teller calls protocol," she said, her voice sharp. "A 74-year-old woman, confused and scared, treated like a violent criminal." Next came Ellie's medical records. Linda called Dr. Sheila Marks, the physician who had treated Ellie after her arrest, to the stand. "Dr. Marks," Linda began, "can you describe the extent of Miss Brooks's injuries?" Dr. Marks nodded. "Miss Brooks suffered a fractured shoulder, extensive bruising on her wrists and forearms, and mild dehydration. Given her age and frailty, these injuries were particularly severe and required immediate medical attention." "And in your professional opinion," Linda continued, "were these injuries consistent with excessive force?" "Yes," Dr. Marks replied firmly. Moreland attempted to discredit the testimony, suggesting that Ellie's injuries could have been accidental or exacerbated by her frailty. But Dr. Marks held her ground, her calm professionalism unshaken. Gray's defense centered on portraying Ellie as uncooperative and framing his actions as necessary. Moreland called Officer Lewis, a department trainer, to testify about use of force protocols. "Officer Teller's actions were in line with departmental guidelines," Lewis said. "When a suspect resists, officers are trained to use the necessary amount of force to gain compliance." "Even if that suspect is a 74-year-old woman with dementia?" Linda asked during cross-examination, her tone razor-sharp. Lewis hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "The guidelines don't make exceptions for age or medical conditions," he admitted. "Thank you," Linda said, turning to the jury. The turning point came when Officer Dana Caldwell took the stand. Dana's hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in, her eyes darting briefly to Gray before settling on Linda. "Officer Caldwell," Linda began, her voice steady but kind. "You were present during Miss Brooks's arrest, correct?" "Yes," Dana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded. "Can you describe what you saw that day?" Dana hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Finally, she looked up, her expression filled with resolve. "I saw Officer Teller use unnecessary force," she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger. Miss Brooks wasn't resisting. She was confused. She didn't understand what was happening. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gray's jaw clenched, his face darkening with fury. "Are you saying Officer Teller's actions were not justified?" Linda pressed. "Yes," Dana said firmly. "They weren't justified." Moreland's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Dana as biased, suggesting she had a personal vendetta against Gray. But Dana held her ground, her voice steady as she repeated her testimony. By the time she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Dana avoided Gray's glare as she returned to her seat, her hands shaking but her conscience finally clear. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew louder. Signs demanding justice and reform waved in the air as chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the streets. Inside, the trial continued, but the tide had shifted. Dana's testimony had cast doubt on Gray's narrative, and Linda Harper was ready to press her advantage. As the day ended, Rachel stepped outside to join the crowd. She stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers who shared her outrage, their voices rising together in a chorus of hope and determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, it felt within reach. The Ridgehaven courthouse brimmed with anticipation on the final day of the trial. The air was thick with tension, each breath shared by the gallery feeling heavier than the last. Outside, the crowd of protesters had swelled. Chants for justice mixed with shouts from counter-protesters, creating a cacophony of voices that seemed to reverberate off the courthouse walls. Rachel Brooks sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept much the night before, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. To her left, Ellie sat quietly, her expression distant but calm. Rachel had insisted her mother be present for this moment, even if Ellie didn't fully understand what was happening. At the defense table, Gray Teller sat stone-faced, his once confident demeanor replaced by a mask of simmering anger. His lawyer, Thomas Moreland, whispered to him, but Gray barely acknowledged him. Across the room, Linda Harper sat with quiet poise, her sharp eyes focused on the jury box. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, all eyes were on them. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, carried a small slip of paper in her hand. Judge Marianne Lowe, seated at the bench, motioned for the court to come to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Lowe said, her voice calm but firm. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she spoke. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent, the only sound the faint shuffling of papers as the judge unfolded the verdict. "In the matter of the State versus Grayson Teller, on the charge of second-degree assault, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, quickly followed by the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. "Order," Judge Lowe commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped Ellie's hand tightly. Ellie, unaware of the significance of the moment, looked at her daughter with a faint smile. Gray's reaction was less subdued. His face turned a deep shade of red as he clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. Moreland placed a calming hand on his client's arm, but Gray shook it off, his eyes narrowing at the jury. The sentencing phase followed shortly after. Linda Harper presented a compelling argument for a strict sentence, citing the need for accountability and the damage done to Ellie and her family. Moreland argued for leniency, claiming Gray had acted under the pressure of his duty as a police officer. When Judge Lowe finally delivered her sentence, the courtroom once again held its breath. "For the charge of second-degree assault, I sentence Officer Grayson Teller to 5 years in state prison," she said, her tone measured but resolute. Gasps echoed through the room once more, followed by a mixture of applause and muffled curses from the gallery. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction was just as divided. Supporters of the verdict held signs reading, "Justice for Ellie," and chanted in celebration. Others, including several off-duty police officers, stood on the opposite side of the street, holding signs that read, "Support our officers," and accusing the system of targeting Gray unfairly. For Rachel, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't erase the pain her mother had endured. As she guided Ellie through the throng of supporters, she paused to hug Linda Harper, her gratitude spilling out in quiet tears. "You made this happen," Rachel whispered. "No," Linda replied, her voice steady. "You did. You fought for your mother when no one else would. This is your victory." For Dana Caldwell, the verdict marked the beginning of the end of her career in law enforcement. That evening, she sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the resignation letter she had written the night before. The trial had taken its toll on her, not just emotionally, but professionally. The department had grown colder toward her with each passing day. Her colleagues avoided her, their stares filled with quiet disdain. The graffiti scrawled on her locker, "Traitor," was only the most visible sign of her isolation. Dana knew she couldn't stay. The culture of silence, the unspoken loyalty that protected officers like Gray, was too deeply entrenched. Her decision to testify against him had made her a pariah, but it had also given her clarity. The next morning, she walked into Captain Doyle's office and handed him her resignation. Doyle barely looked at her as he took the letter, his expression a mask of indifference. "Good luck, Caldwell," he said flatly. "Thanks," Dana replied, her voice steady. As she left the station for the last time, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She had loved being a police officer once, but that love had been eroded by years of compromise and silence. In the weeks that followed, Dana found a new purpose. She joined Justice Reimagined, a grassroots activist group dedicated to police reform and community justice. The work was challenging, but deeply fulfilling. For the first time in years, Dana felt like she was making a real difference. At a community meeting, she stood in front of a small but engaged crowd, speaking about her experiences and the changes she hoped to see in the system. "We can't keep pretending this is someone else's problem," Dana said, her voice strong. "It's our problem, and if we don't stand up and demand accountability, nothing will ever change." Among the audience was Rachel, who approached Dana after the meeting. "Thank you," Rachel said simply. Dana smiled. "Thank you for fighting. Your mother deserved better, and so does every other person who's been let down by the system." Back in Ridgehaven, the protests continued, though their focus began to shift. What started as a call for justice for Ellie Brooks had grown into a broader movement for police accountability and systemic change. Signs demanding reform filled the streets, and community leaders began organizing meetings to address long-standing grievances. For Rachel, life slowly began to find a new rhythm. Ellie's recovery was slow, and her dementia continued to worsen, but Rachel was determined to make her remaining years as peaceful as possible. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Ellie looked up at Rachel, a faint smile on her lips. "Are we home?" Ellie asked softly. "Yes, Mom," Rachel replied, her voice thick with emotion. "We're home." Gray Teller's sentencing sent ripples through the small town. Some saw it as a long overdue reckoning, while others viewed it as an unjust punishment. But for Rachel, Dana, and the countless others who had fought for justice, it was a step forward, a small but significant victory in a much larger battle. As Rachel watched the evening news and saw footage of protesters marching with signs calling for reform, she felt a flicker of hope. Change was slow, but it was possible. And for Ellie, for Dana, and for everyone else who had been failed by the system, that hope was worth holding on to. Ellie Brooks returned home on a gray morning, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored Rachel's weary heart. The house felt quieter than ever, as if it too carried the weight of the last few months. Rachel helped Ellie to her favorite chair by the window, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders. "There we go, Mom," Rachel said gently. "You're home now." Ellie stared out the window, her expression distant. The bruises on her arms had faded, but the fragile air about her remained. Her once vivid personality, though often fragmented by her dementia, now felt muted, as if the ordeal had chipped away at the spark that made Ellie who she was. Rachel sat on the edge of the sofa, watching her mother closely. "Do you need anything, Mom? Tea? Something to eat?" Ellie didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze to the trees swaying in the wind outside. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat and decided to sit with her in silence, offering her presence as a balm for Ellie's unspoken pain. Days turned into weeks, and while Ellie's physical injuries began to heal, her emotional wounds lingered. She spoke less, often retreating into herself for long stretches. Rachel tried everything to comfort her: music, favorite books, even old photo albums. But Ellie's responses were minimal. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Ellie sat in her chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Rachel bustled around the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a faint sound. "Rachel?" Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't heard her mother say her name in weeks. She hurried to the living room, kneeling in front of Ellie. "I'm here, Mom. What is it?" Ellie's cloudy eyes seemed to clear for a moment, focusing on Rachel's face. A soft, fragile smile tugged at her lips. "You're my flower," Ellie said, her voice trembling but full of warmth. Rachel's breath hitched, tears springing to her eyes. She reached for Ellie's hands, holding them tightly. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ellie leaned back in her chair, her smile lingering as her gaze returned to the window. Home, she murmured softly. Rachel stayed by her side long after Ellie had drifted to sleep, her heart filled with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and hope. The protests in Ridgehaven showed no signs of stopping. Though Grayteller had been convicted, the community's fight for systemic change had only just begun. Rachel attended every rally she could, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had become like family in their shared cause. One evening, as the sun set over the courthouse steps, Rachel spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Dana Caldwell stood near the edge of the gathering, holding a sign that read, "Justice is accountability." Rachel made her way through the crowd, stopping beside Dana. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said with a faint smile. Dana glanced at Rachel, her own smile tinged with weariness. "Couldn't stay away," she replied. "This fight, it's personal now." Rachel nodded, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "For everything you did, for speaking out when no one else would." Dana's expression softened. "I didn't do enough," she admitted, "but I'm trying to do better now. We all have to." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the chants of the crowd. The energy was palpable, a steady rhythm of hope and determination. "We keep going," Rachel said, her voice firm. Dana nodded. "We keep going." A week later, Dana stood on Rachel's porch, a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hand. The blooms were vibrant, their colors echoing the flowers Ellie had clutched on the day of her arrest. Dana had spent hours picking them from a meadow outside of town, wanting the gesture to mean something. Rachel answered the door, her face lighting up with surprise when she saw Dana. "Dana," she said warmly, "come in." Dana stepped inside, her gaze immediately falling on Ellie, who was sitting in her chair by the window. She seemed smaller than Dana remembered, her frailty more pronounced, but there was a quiet peace about her that hadn't been there before. "Hi, Ellie," Dana said softly as she approached. Ellie turned her head slowly, her eyes landing on the wildflowers in Dana's hands. A faint smile curved her lips. "For you," Dana said, holding out the bouquet. Ellie's hands trembled as she reached for the flowers, her touch gentle and reverent. She brought them to her face, inhaling deeply. "Flowers?" Ellie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're beautiful." Dana crouched beside her, her own smile soft. "Just like the ones you picked," she said. Ellie's gaze shifted to Dana, her eyes glistening. "Home," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of meaning that made Dana's chest tighten. "Yes," Dana said, her voice steady. "You're home." Outside the house, the faint sound of protesters chanting could still be heard, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. The fight for change continued, a steady pulse of hope and resilience that refused to fade. Inside, Rachel, Dana, and Ellie sat together, their shared presence a quiet testament to healing and the enduring power of connection. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, there was, at last, a glimmer of hope. As the story of Ellie Brooks comes to a close, we're left with powerful questions that linger in the heart. What does justice truly look like in cases like Ellie's, where the harm has already been done? Do you believe real change can happen when individuals like Dana step forward? Or is the system too deeply rooted in its flaws? And perhaps most importantly, how can we ensure the most vulnerable among us are treated with the compassion and dignity they deserve? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below, and let's keep this important conversation going. Thank you for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more impactful stories like this.